This is the BBC.
Hello, this is the Arts and Ideas podcast and I'm Shahid Abari. I'm pretty sure of that. But who are you? And how can I know that you're not a zombie? We'll be talking about the philosopher Ludwig Wittgenstein, the private language argument and the problem of other minds. Join us just after this.
Music that stops you in your tracks. And a man who became a hero. A composer who inspired the world. I'm Donald MacLeod. Join me as I make an epic podcast journey through the life, music and ideas of Ludwig van Beethoven. I'll be telling his story in unprecedented detail throughout 2020. The secret love affairs, his tragic hearing loss, disasters and triumphs, struggle and transcendence. It's a story to inspire, with music that just might change your life. In 20 years of presenting Composer of the Week, I've never attempted anything this ambitious before. I'd love you to join me. Just search for Composer of the Week in BBC Sounds and press subscribe.
Hello, how are you? I wonder what you're thinking right now. In fact, do you even think at all? No offence, but it's hard for me to tell. I know that I think and feel. In fact, truth be told, I'm a little hungry and mulling over where to get a cheese toastie after this show. But how do I know that you have a working mind and an inner life too? Do you also want a cheese toastie? Who knows? In philosophy, the idea that the inner lives of others is a mystery to us is sometimes called the problem of other minds. And it's not just a question of what others think and feel, but whether they can think and feel at all. In short, how do we know that other people aren't zombies? In today's programme, I'll be asking my guests if they are zombies, and we'll be looking at an idea called the private language argument, developed by the 20th century Austrian philosopher Ludwig Wittgenstein.
Listen to me. We imagine the meaning of what we say as something queer, mysterious, hidden from view. But nothing is hidden. Everything is open to view. It's just philosophers who muddy the waters.
Carl Johnson playing Wittgenstein there in the 1993 film Wittgenstein, directed by Derek Jarman. Here at Free Thinking we try to clear up muddy waters, of course. So joining me are philosopher professors Dennis McManus from the University of Southampton and Stephen Mulhall from the University of Oxford, and historian of emotions Tiffany Watt-Smith from Queen Mary University of London. Shall we start at the beginning with Wittgenstein? Stephen, for people not familiar with Wittgenstein, who was he and where do we place him in the larger historical context of philosophy?
He was probably one of the two most significant philosophers of the 20th century. He was born in 1889 to a wealthy industrial family in Austria. Very highly cultured. They were Jewish, although they converted to Catholicism. And he wasn't, in fact, given much of an education in the humanities, I think. He was interested primarily in engineering. Then he got interested in the mathematics behind engineering. And then he got interested in the logic that might lie behind mathematics. And that took him to Cambridge just before the First World War. He worked with equally famous figures in the analytic tradition there, Bertrand Russell and G. Moore. Then he got caught up in the First World War, and in fact he composed his first major philosophical work, the Tractatus Logico-Philosophicus, when he was held in a prisoner of war camp immediately after the First World War. It was published in 1921, and it is an amazing achievement in itself, a really sort of crystalline expression of a certain kind of European modernism. It just consists of 7 very simply stated propositions and a great deal of elaborate commentary on those propositions. A very impersonal tone of voice, not much sense of other people showing up in the world in that book. What he was really focused on was the essential nature of the relationship between language and reality, how it was possible for words to represent reality. But the book seems to present that relationship in a vacuum. It's nevertheless was meant to contain the solution to all essential philosophical problems, and so as a result, being a consistent kind of person, Wittgenstein retired from the profession, having published the book. He took up various non-philosophical tasks like teaching at a primary school in Austria, working as a gardener in a monastery, and then he helped design a house for his sister in a deeply modernist sort of idiom before he was kind of gradually sucked back into the philosophical profession. And he started rethinking the basic foundations of his first philosophical project in the Tractatus. And over the 1930s and into the 40s, he started developing, in effect, a second major philosophical project that in many ways is taken by most of its readers to be a kind of systematic critique of the first perspective. And the private language argument is at the centre of the major textual expression of that later philosophy, which is the philosophical investigations.
And the philosophical investigations, is it like anything that preceded it and what comes after it? How radical is it?
It has its own incredibly distinctive literary form, but one which stands in really sharp contrast to what I was describing as the literary form of the Tractatus. Here what you have, instead of 7 crystalline propositions, is a numbered sequence of remarks, some of which are a sentence long, some of which might take a page, 3 or 4 paragraphs, and woven into the text is a multiplicity of topics and a multiplicity of voices that are talking with one another, arguing with one another, speculating with one another about how best to handle the various ramifications of those topics. So it reads almost as if it had been written by a completely different person. And it's a book within which that vacuum I was talking about earlier, where the relationship between words and reality is seen as it were, capable of being understood entirely in its own terms, has suddenly been embedded in a social context. So what gets taken most seriously is the idea that language is something shared between people, and it's part of their much more general, fundamental culture and form of life.
Brilliant, thank you, very clear. The Philosophical Investigations, which is published in 1953 posthumously after Wittgenstein's death, is where we get this idea of the private language argument. And Dennis, I know you've been wrestling with the private language argument for a long time. Before we get into the nuts and bolts of it, and I think there are nuts and bolts involved,
certainly are.
Tell me, when did you first come across it?
Yeah, so this was when I was an undergraduate. And just a tiny little bit of background, a crucial idea in philosophy of mind is this idea of qualia, subjective feel, qualitative content. Now, what that refers to are things like the painfulness of pain. So if you like, beyond the characteristic causes of pain and the characteristic kind of behavioural responses that you produce when you have pain, there seems to be, if you like, within, you might call it, the pain itself, the way it feels. Other examples would be things like the distinctive taste of coffee, which we feel we can't really articulate. We can't explain to somebody what it is. We can't explain verbally without actually giving them a cup of coffee. Go and try it, experience it. Similarly, things like the yellowness of yellow, the distinctive way in which that particular colour manifests itself to us. Again, you mentioned zombies at the start. It's another way in which people try and capture this idea of qualia. Some people argue that it's conceivable that one of us, let's say it's Stephen, he's the most plausible candidate. Yeah. He might move in the same ways as we do. He might say the same things as we do. He might be subject to the same stimuli as we do. But it's possible, some philosophers argue, that inside that head there isn't that sparkle of consciousness. There isn't that the way the pain feels itself. So what happened to me was I was doing a course on philosophy of mind, and my tutor at the time, Anita Abamidis, who Stephen will know well, I'd got to the point where I found myself saying, so if there's one thing we really know for certain, if there's one, if you like, rock we can build our philosophy of mind on, it's the fact that qualia are real. These subjective feels are undeniable. This interior life of the mind is absolutely beyond question. So I found myself saying that, or probably more likely, Anita manoeuvred me to the point where I found myself saying that. And she sat there and said, well, that's very interesting. Have a look at this for next week, and slides a reading list over to me. And this was Wittgenstein, and in particular, the private language argument, which obviously we'll be talking about quite what the argument amounts to, but part of the promise of the private language argument is that it undoes all those intuitions about the nature of the mind, the priority of the inner, in the way that...
Is that what happened to you?
It certainly first sows seeds of doubt. As we'll see when we look at the argument, it's difficult to know quite what the argument is and quite what it shows. You might almost think that if the private language argument shows that qualia are unreal, so much the worse for the private language argument. Qualia seems so real, seems so undeniable. And yet, that's the promise of the private language argument. It seems to suggest things can't be quite as they seem.
So is it that we can't deny the coffeeness of coffee, or that we can deny the coffeeness of coffee?
Well, so this is one of the things that you find discussed in these passages is just what is it that is having doubt cast on it. Because we feel, there is a distinctive taste of coffee. We can't articulate it to others verbally. It would be insane to deny that there is this thing that, the way pain feels. And one of the things that you see in these discussions is Wittgenstein saying, look, I'm not denying the existence of pain. It may sound as if I'm saying that there's just the behaviour and there's just the stimulation of the body, and inside it's just dark. But that seems crazy. The kind of characteristic move that Wittgenstein makes over and over again is to say it will look as if I am denying the existence of something, I'm destroying something, but really all I'm destroying are philosophers' fantasies of what pain is, of what sensations are, of what it is to have a sensibility. You get this recurrent theme that it's only philosophers' misconstruals of these phenomena that he wants to deny.
Can I ask you one question before I go on to Tiffany? I get the sense that young Dennis read this not so long ago and felt...
baby Dennis.
felt the rug pulled out from under him.
Yeah, exactly.
And then the slightly older Dennis carried on reading it. I think we are, of course, going to talk more about the nuts and bolts of the private language argument, but I want to hold on to this idea of the coffeeness of the coffee, or the qualia, and then the word coffee. And Tiffany, I want to draw you in here because you think about interior life in your work on the history of emotions, and Wittgenstein is thinking about the tussle between shared language and private experience too. Is that an idea that means something to you?
Absolutely. I mean, actually, I was listening to you, I was thinking I also encountered Wittgenstein in my first year at university when I was doing philosophy, and then phrases like the coffeeness of coffee, I think, sort of overwhelmed me so much that I hot-footed it over to the English department. So it strikes me as interesting that I've come around in my intellectual journey to thinking about Wittgenstein again, but I definitely have. I mean, to in my field, which is the history of emotions, Wittgenstein is hugely important, although not always credited in that way. In 1941, the French historian Lucien Febvre talked about how, as historians, we really needed to try and understand the affective life of the past. He claimed that anger in the 17th century was not the same as the anger that he felt today. And this seemed an extraordinary claim to make. I mean, how is it possible that we could know how people felt in the past who are now dead and buried? How do we know even what they were feeling at all, and whether it's the same as what we're feeling now, and so on? So this call to historians to study the emotions of the past, raised all these difficulties. And then, a few years later, we get the private language argument, which encourages us, I think, to think about emotional life, not in terms of introspection, not in terms of private psychology, but to sort of swivel the lens outwards and to think about these public criteria of emotions and these public networks through which we understand an emotion, whether that's language or, as I think he talks about much later, gesture and facial expression and so on is also part of this criteria through which we can judge whether someone's feeling something or not. And of course, as historians, we can study those things. We can study public criteria. We can study language and how it changes from time to time and also from place to place. So actually, I think Wittgenstein appears at a really critical point in the emergence of my discipline and actually gives us the tools to study the history of the emotions of the past.
And this problem of other minds, does that bear on your work, Tiffany?
I think it's always part of what haunts the history of emotion and also the study of emotions of different cultures. One of the things that's interesting to me, and I know we'll talk about pain a lot later, but one of the things that's interesting to me about the way Wittgenstein focuses on pain is that pain is one of those feelings or sensations that we often worry that other people are putting on or feigning. I think that and love, I think, are probably the two that we worry about most. And the idea that someone might be not feeling the same quality or gravitas of pain that we're experiencing, can be quite amusing when it's kind of married couples complaining about whose headache is worse. But I'm not that I've ever experienced that. But it can also be, highly significant for when we're kind of contemplating how we engage with other people around us, other people who might not look or behave exactly like we do. It's been on my mind because it's in the news recently, was the Boston Marathon bomber, Zarnev, and he, during his trial, one of the things that was a real issue was the fact that he didn't appear to be suffering remorse. He didn't seem to have the pain of remorse, and this was reported very widely in the press and appears to have been part of how the jury reached their decision. But the neuroscientist Lisa Feldman Barrett has pointed out, and I'm sure other people have too, that in his culture a kind of certain stoicism, a kind of stillness would have been the appropriate response to that public kind of forum. It's very inappropriate, therefore, to suggest that one sort of behaviour didn't demonstrate pain, because in fact it may well have demonstrated pain. What I'm saying in a rather long-winded way is that it's really important to me that we create this moment of strangeness, I think, this gap between language and behaviour, and then the feeling that may or may not be there underneath. If we can acknowledge that there is a gap between the emotions that we're experiencing and then the networks of meaning with which those emotions are described, if we can see that and understand that those languages are contingent, then it makes it possible for us to imagine that same thing might be happening with other people who don't look and behave exactly like us.
Great, thank you. I feel like we've started to answer this question already, but Stephen, I want to ask you from a philosophical perspective. I think the question is, why should we care? I mean, I started jokingly about this question about whether we're all other people are zombies. I know that I'm myself, but are you zombies? And I presented it as a joke, but philosophers take that question very seriously, and Wittgenstein in particular. So why should we be concerned about whether other people are zombies?
Well, I think the issue that seems to me the most resonant and fundamental in this discussion is really just captured by the notion of privacy. I'm much less moved personally and professionally by worry about someone looking just like a human being and lacking any interior life, whatever, than I am by the worry about whether I've got another person's mental state right or not, whether I've properly understood what they're thinking or feeling, what their mood or their emotion is. And of course, this is one of the crucial parts of the structure of this problem. If they're other minds to me, I'm another mind to them. So if I have skeptical anxieties about what exactly they're thinking about something that might be really important to me, presumably there's an anxiety on my side about whether I'm comprehensible in the same kind of way, whether what I'm regarding as deeply significant has really been conveyed to other people, whether they're really properly acknowledging what it is that I'm going through, if it's a case of pain or suffering or certain kinds of emotions. So it's that kind of anxiety that I think is interesting. I take it that's why we use this concept of privacy. And I don't know, maybe this would be a good point to try and get towards the text a bit more, because
do it. Do you have something
there's a particular section of the book, section 243 of the Investigations, where Wittgenstein introduces the problem in his own terms. So I'll just read out that passage. A human being can encourage himself, give himself orders, obey, blame, and punish himself. He can ask himself a question and answer it. We could even imagine human beings who spoke only in monologue, who accompanied their activities by talking to themselves. An explorer who watched them and listened to their talk might succeed in translating their language into ours. This would enable him to predict these people's actions correctly, for he also hears them making resolutions and decisions. But could we also imagine a language in which a person could write down or give vocal expression to his inner experiences, his feelings, moods, and the rest, for his private use? Well, can't we do so in our ordinary language? But that is not what I mean. The individual words of this language are to refer to what can only be known to the person speaking, to his immediate private sensations. So another person cannot understand the language. So that's taken to be the kind of initial remark in this sequence of remarks that we're calling the private language argument. And maybe it's worth making a couple of points about that before others join in and maybe draw more out of it. So one crucial thing here is that the notion of privacy that Wittgenstein's working with is not the ordinary everyday familiar notion of privacy. That's the notion that he refers to when the interlocutor in this dialogue says, can't we perfectly well write down and give vocal expression to our inner experiences for private use? We can keep diaries, we can keep records of various kinds that we, go up to our bedrooms every night and fill in and don't let anybody else see, put a lock on the diary. But of course, anything in that kind of diary could, in principle, be shared with other people. So that kind of privacy, you might say, is contingent, right?
It's not entirely private.
Exactly, right. So the interlocutor brings out the idea that that's not the kind of privacy he's really interested in or fascinated by. He's interested in a possibility of what you might call logical or metaphysical privacy, where it's not possible, it's not conceivable to imagine your inner experience being capable of being communicated to anybody else. You have a perfect, transparent grasp of it. But by definition, anyone who isn't in the position to have those experiences can't possibly make head or tail of what it is that you're going through.
Dennis, do you want to come in? How do you take the private language argument?
Well, I think as Stephen says, there's this key idea of privacy or of interiority, or however you might put it, which to link to, if you like, broader issues within philosophy. There are well-established tendencies within philosophy since Descartes to think of the mind as in some way self-contained, set back from behavioural manifestations, set back from the life of the body in some respects. So philosophers have developed for themselves this sense of the mind as this distinctive interior space to which the owner of that mind, if you like, has what gets referred to as privileged access. They have this special form of knowledge of that inner space. And it's so special that it can rather embarrass any other kind of knowledge claims, because claims to know anything beyond the mind start looking distinctly iffy, because they don't have that special quality that claims about your own interior little inner theatre have. And these forms of scepticism have kind of haunted philosophy, certainly since Descartes. And Mill gives is one of the early great statements. It's not that early, I suppose, of other mind scepticism. So if it should turn out that this vision of the inner is suspect, then the promise again is this, that we might actually exercise some of these ghosts.
So the second point I was wanting to draw out of that opening remark was really implicit in what Dennis was saying, that there is a kind of historical context for this. Ever since Descartes had such a sort of massive impact on the development of modern philosophy, this idea of individuality as being sort of centered around a kind of interior life that's both incredibly valuable to the individual and in a certain way problematically at best accessible to other people. This is kind of part of the way modernity thinks about itself. So it's not just a kind of a philosopher's problem. It seems to me this is a kind of picture about the relationship between inner and outer that people who are brought up in modern Western European cultures would find completely intuitive. Just part of the way, as it were, they're brought up to think about their status in the world.
Yeah, Tiffany, I know you're not a Wittgenstein scholar, but that account of an absolute privacy, more private than private, something that's not shareable in any way other than it's understood by you, and from which is connected to an idea of scepticism too, that somebody else might be in possession of that and it might be difficult for us to understand. Is that something that bears on your own thinking about this absolutely private experience?
I think no, actually. I mean, I think that one of the things that happens with the history of emotions is, and I think you used a nice phrase at the beginning, which was something like overturning those intuitions or sort of reversing those intuitions, is that intuition that there is somewhere a kind of very private self that we can understand through introspection, and that's basically what we can know, and that emotions are very much part of that. That idea, I think, gets turned on its head by the idea that there might be a history of emotions, which that that then there is a language which sits outside of those private experiences, and that language has these concepts which shape our kind of relatively inchoate sensations. Understanding that language, which is both words and gestures and meanings and values and all sorts of other things, explanations and so on. Once we understand that language, then that is basically how we experience our emotions. So historians of emotions might say, you know, our emotions are not our own. They belong to this public realm, and we use the tools that we learn in this public realm to interpret what the kind of strange things that our body does, and turn those strange things into emotions, give them some sort of form, give them some sort of meaning.
Isn't that the argument part of the private language argument, that Wittgenstein is arguing with the idea of that private language? Is that right?
Yeah. I mean, his worry is whether we can make any coherent sense of this idea of a sort of absolute or logical privacy. And if not, what that says about us, in effect. You know, the way we understand ourselves, the way we interpret ourselves. And I think probably there are kind of three main points where he's trying to work out what's problematic about this kind of modern intuition of privacy. It's quite often familiar to draw a distinction between what gets called epistemic privacy and privacy of ownership. So Wittgenstein suggests that there are kind of two interrelated ideas that go to make up this idea of privacy. And one has to do with who knows what, who has the authority with respect to these phenomena, and what the gap is in terms of epistemology, in other words, in terms of knowledge, doubt, and certainty, between a third-person perspective on my pain and my own perspective on my pain. And the other one is the idea of, as it were, who owns the pains, whose they are, who they belong to. And I think actually that second idea really does pick up on a certain culturally specific, modern notion of what it is to be a kind of autonomous individual. You know, if you don't own your own experience in a kind of modern capitalist world, then something's going seriously wrong. You know, the idea of self-ownership has all kinds of cultural ramifications beyond this, but this is a central part of it, that if it's your emotion or if it's your feeling, nobody else can have what you have. It's a kind of metaphysically private property.
Yeah, it's one of the tricks of his writing that he almost seduces you with an idea, the idea of a private language that seems very alluring and real to you. But then there's an argument that was refuting the possibility of that precisely because of the language. What is the actual argument against that case for privacy? That's what I want to know.
When we talk about the private language argument, what people tend to mean is they mean a certain set of remarks within the philosophical investigations. Now, he talks about it in other works as well, makes similar moves in other works. There seem to be a set of different kind of considerations that he advances, but there's one particular little drama that often is seen as the key. Shall I give it a go?
Do you have a reading? Brilliant.
I do.
This is like a philosophy seminar, which I love. I'm getting great flashbacks, but not of the exams.
Okay, so this is section 258 of the investigations. So he says, let us imagine the following case. I want to keep a diary about the recurrence of a certain sensation. To this end, I associate it with the sign S. It's in quotes. I'm doing invisible quotes for the radio listener. S, and writes this sign in a calendar for every day on which I have the sensation. I remark, first of all, that a definition of the sign cannot be formulated. But still, I can give myself a kind of ostensive definition, surely. You know, these are the voices that Stephen talked about, this kind of conversation. Anyway, back to Wittgenstein. Still, I can give myself a kind of ostensive definition. How? Can I point to the sensation? Well, not in the ordinary sense. But I speak or write the sign down, and at the same time I concentrate my attention on the sensation, and so, as it were, point to it inwardly. But what is this ceremony for? For that is all it seems to be. A definition surely serves to establish the meaning of a sign. Well, that's done precisely by the concentrating of my attention, for in this way I impress on myself the connection between the sign and the sensation. I impress it on myself can only mean this process brings it about that I remember the connection right in the future. But in the present case, I have no criterion of correctness. One would like to say whatever is going to seem right to me is right. And that only means that here we can't talk about right, again, in quotes. So in this, what he seems to be doing here is he's kind of saying to the philosopher of this kind of interiority, you imagine yourself being able to describe the contents of this mind conceived in the way that you do. In order to be able to describe the contents of your minds, you're going to have concepts that you can use to describe it. You're going to have to establish some kind of system of categories and classifications, if you like, in order to say, yes, here's sensation S or here's sensation T. But what Wittgenstein seems to be doing there is saying, okay, how is that meant to work then? Talk me through how this is actually meant to work. How do you establish the system of concepts which you're going to draw upon in constructing these descriptions? And the upshot of that passage seems to be, now quite what happens in that passage is something which I trust we will have a little bit of a conversation about. The upshot of it seems to be they can't fix these concepts. They can't give the concepts that they will use to describe this distinctive inner life, they can't give them content. So they can't give them a determinate, if you like, go back to the language of language, talking about S, they can't give S a determinate meaning. That seems to be what he's arguing in this key passage.
He's saying, look, we have this very, very general tendency, a tendency that the author of the Tractatus seemed also to exemplify, to think that the basic relationship between words and reality is one of naming or referring, picking out objects, denoting them. And that's what we tend to think when we think about the word pain. We think that what's happening when we use the word is that we pick out an object. It's just that this object is metaphysically private. Right? And the worry here is that you really shouldn't underestimate the scale of the task that the diarist is taking on. Right? If he's right about the nature of our interior life, then everything in our psychological vocabulary about our mind and our moods and our emotions will have to be set up and stabilized and deployed only by him. Right? This really is a logically private language. And what Wittgenstein is saying in 258 is that the moment you think that you need to define the meanings of the words you're going to use to keep track of your sensations, you have to set up a standard of correctness for future use of those words. And what Wittgenstein is trying to show is that would only be set up, you could only set that up successfully, if it was possible for you, when you meet a future candidate sensation, to remember the original sensation that you associated the sign S with. But in order to be able to do that, you have to be able to distinguish memories of S from memories of T or U or V. But if you were capable of distinguishing S memories from T memories, then you must already know what the meaning of the word S is in order to be able to use correctly phrases like S memories. So in short, on the one hand, it's only if you can identify the memory correctly that you've conferred a meaning on the word, but in order to identify the meaning correctly, you must already have conferred meaning on the word.
What I'm understanding is that there is an idea of a language that is presupposing those very feelings that it's trying to capture. I'm longing for some examples. That's a classic philosophy class, I remember, a number of people on a ship. And Wittgenstein does use one rather striking example, which is about the beetle in a box, which I found very bizarre, and I'm hoping you're going to be able to illuminate me about. Because he says, we each of us have a beetle in a box that we call a beetle, but none of us can look into another's box and know that it is a beetle that resembles ours. What on earth is he trying to do with the box beetle?
Is it worth reading out the passage, or do you just want to talk about it abstract?
Why don't we talk about it?
Because it does matter how he formulates it, I think.
Okay, go for it, Stephen.
So this is 293, section 293 in the book. So he says, suppose everyone had a box with something in it. We call it a beetle. No one can look into anyone else's box, and everyone says he knows what a beetle is only by looking at his beetle. Here it would be quite possible for everyone to have something different in his box. One might even imagine such a thing constantly changing. But suppose the word beetle had a use in these people's language. If so, it wouldn't be used as the name of a thing. The thing in the box has no place in the language game at all, not even as a something, for the box might even be empty. No, one can divide through by the thing in the box. It cancels out whatever it is. And then he draws the moral. If we construe the grammar of the expression of sensation on the model of object and designation, the object drops out of consideration as irrelevant. And in a certain sense, this is exactly the focus of the 258 passage about keeping the diary. There's exactly the same underlying picture that Wittgenstein's trying to bring out and criticize. So what he's doing with the beetle in the box example is saying, well, look, let's take that picture seriously, right? If it really were the case that we should think about the word pain and the phenomenon pain on the model of object and name, well, what would it actually be like? And the example of the beetle in the box really objectifies pain, right? So think about it as a kind of thing in a container, where the container is your body, right? If you have a use for the word that you think names something in that box, whatever kind of use it could have, it couldn't be a naming use. It couldn't be a label for an entity that's inside the box. Because if that were the case, you could end up with a situation where there was absolutely nothing in anyone's box. In other words, the functioning of the language and the metaphysical picture of what it's referring to just fall apart. And that, I think, just to go back to 258, is what's usually taken to be driving the anxiety about whether or not there could be a way of keeping note of your sensations if those sensations were metaphysically private.
I mean, this, in a way, this is going to get us into the issues about exactly how we should understand these passages. I guess I would just mention one other way of thinking about what might be going on in that passage, which is to say that even if you could, if you like, get that sample back, that original sample, just suppose for the sake of argument, you do find yourself once again looking at that original sample that you use to try and specify what you mean by S. It doesn't seem to be able to perform the explanatory role that we think it does. So in a way, to go back to the beetle case, in both cases, the thing that we think is going to make all the difference can't make the difference we want it to make. So in the case of the sample, you might, suppose you do recover that original sample of S, and you say, okay, so that is what I meant by S. But of course, that sample might be, say it's a sample of, a yellow sensation. You might say, right, okay, so it meant yellow. But then that sensation is also maybe a bright yellow. Or maybe it was a sensation that you had at a particular time, or perhaps it was caused in a particular way. And just getting the sample back doesn't tell you, if you like, what it was about this sample that you were picking out as fixing the meaning of these terms. There's all this debate about exactly how these arguments are meant to work. But another possible thought that might have some part to play here is that the sample can't do the job, because as where the sample just sits there, describable in multiple ways, and will not tell you how it should be described. So this notion that, if you like, the sample will fix the concept, well, unfortunately, the sample can't fix the concept because it instantiates too many concepts. So again, this hope on the part of this kind of philosopher of interiority that they've got this inner realm, that then they've got these concepts using which they can describe it. Wittgenstein's prodding them and saying, okay, so talk us through how that's supposed to work. And one of the things that seems to be happening in these passages is that the explanations that they, if you like, assume they have at the back of their minds for how these things are meant to work, turn out to not deliver. They can't really make sense of some of these structures that they've been relying upon.
A romantic person might think that there is something about the ineffability of experience that is in excess of language. But that's not what Wittgenstein is arguing. Wittgenstein is arguing that our experiences are logically private. So I wonder, what does that mean for something to be logically private?
He's not arguing that they are. He's arguing that there's something deeply problematic in the idea that they are. And I think, one way of understanding what he's doing is in a sense, reminding us of aspects of our everyday experience in relationships with others that we tend to forget once we start becoming fixated on these ideas of privacy. So, when Dennis was articulating what philosophers call qualia, part of what's going on there is an epistemically articulated notion of privacy. So the thought is other people at best can only kind of guess or surmise what's going on in us. They have to go on our behaviour. And of course, behaviour can often be misleading or unrepresentative of our inner life. Whereas we know with absolute certainty, if we feel pain, then we're immediately necessarily aware of feeling pain. There's no possibility of not knowing it. So we have a kind of certainty of access to our inner life that other people lack. And that's a crucial part of what flows into this idea of a metaphysical privacy. And Wittgenstein tries to disarticulate both halves of that thought. He says explicitly that one part of the idea is false and the other part is nonsense. He says that if we're using the word to know as we ordinarily use it, then we very often know perfectly well what somebody else is feeling. I had a very good idea what my wife was feeling at 10 last night on election night. There was no room for doubt. But also there's something wrong with this sense that we have first-person certainty in relation to our feelings as well, because it pushes the wrong model of our relationship to our own feelings on us. And what Wittgenstein says is, look, it's absurd to try to characterize your own relation to your feelings and moods, to pain or sensations more generally, in terms of knowledge. Because if your mode of access to your own feelings was epistemic in that sense, it would be the kind of thing where you'd need evidence to make the claims that you make, where the evidence might turn out not to justify the conclusion you've drawn, where you might be mistaken about what you're feeling. And one of the crucial advantages of the example of pain for Wittgenstein is that it doesn't make any sense to imagine someone being in pain and thinking that they're experiencing joy. What would that be like? It's just absurd. The problem here is not so much that, as it were, we're less than certain about what's going on. Our feelings are too close to us for this epistemic model of knowledge, evidence, doubt, and so on to be applicable.
It's that we feel pain, but that we don't know that we feel pain, that we just feel pain.
We have pain. We are in pain. We're immersed in it. We're impaled on it. It's not the epistemic picture that's being foisted on the first-person case is one in which we have objects and a subject observing the object, and then that subject might turn out to be mistaken, or he or she might have good evidence for identifying the nature or presence of that object. But that just makes us, as it were, too detached and distanced from ourselves. Our feelings are things that we have. We're kind of absolutely immersed in them. It's too close to us.
It's curious that
to be something we could know.
It's curious, that makes perfect sense to me, but it's curious that his own writing has a degree of detachment to it. And Dennis, I wanted to ask you particularly about his account of pain, because he's very interested in pain. He spends a lot of time worrying about whether I can know another person is in pain, or even whether I myself am in pain. Why is that of so much interest to him?
You mean the particular example of pain? I guess there's various reasons why you might be drawn to that particular example. One would be, when we think about some of the other candidates for these kinds of subjective fields and so forth, it seems to be more easy to convince yourself that you might be able to, say, point to yellow. You might be able to point to something and, this is what I mean by yellow. This is the yellow that I see. The same doesn't seem to be true of something like pain. I can point to where I have my pain, but when I do so, I don't show you my pain, if you like, in the way that we might allow ourselves to imagine that we can do so in the case of something like pointing to a yellow object. Now, the person who is wedded to the kind of vision that we're talking about thinks, actually, even in the yellow case, this isn't really possible, because we don't know that what's going on inside the mind of the other person is actually the same thing as is going on in our own minds. I guess another thought would be there's a certain simplicity to pain, or at least an apparent simplicity to pain, which might draw you to that particular example. There are other kinds of inner states, inner emotions, which are more obviously tied in with, if you like, the course of a life. So if we were talking about something like sadness, or a nice example he has in the investigations, the example of grief. It's difficult to imagine grief as the simple interior state that pain might seem to be, because of the way in which we can only really envisage somebody experiencing grief in the context of a particular kind of story, in a particular situation, having had certain experiences, and will have certain kinds of consequences. So he has this nice little example in the investigations where he says, can we imagine somebody experiencing grief for just 1 second? Is it 1 second or 1 minute? I'm trying to remember. Just 1 second, and then it stops. And then maybe it comes back for another second, and then it goes away. And this seems to be inconceivable because it's to use an expression he uses, something like grief is part of a certain kind of weave of life, as he puts it. Now, maybe one of the reasons why we're drawn to the pain case is because pain might seem to be able to step out of that kind of weave. So in a way, it's the kind of hard case for somebody who wants to go after this notion of interiority. Maybe other candidates are less plausible, but pain might seem to have that kind of detachment.
Yeah. And I'm sure that's where Tiffany's range of reference would be really interesting. Yeah, because if you do think about emotions or character traits or dispositions as opposed to thinking about immediate sensations, what you would get is a very different sense of the, as it were, the balance of epistemic power between other people and yourself. Suppose I'm a jealous person, right? Other people might be much quicker and much more adept at spotting that fact about me than I am. Yeah. I might have to be taken aside by one of my friends and have patterns of behaviour pointed out to me that I haven't really appreciated, and then I suddenly realise, actually, my interior life is partly structured by a jealous disposition. So in a certain sense, if you focus too hard on the example of pain, you get exactly the problem that Dennis was picking out. And I'm sure that if you think about emotions not just as a general group within which there are lots of specific differences, but as having a history themselves, as being culturally and socially informed, then you'd end up with a much, much more complex map of what the relationship between the individual's capacity to identify what they're feeling and thinking and what the other person thinks and feels.
Well, I was just going to say, one of the things that seems really crucial in that version, and that you picked up on as well, which is that the emotions not only have temporality, but they also have to exist within narrative, and that narrative is what allows us to make those assumptions about what someone else is feeling based on maybe what we might feel in that mode, or what we've seen other people in films and books and so on do in that mode. So, and of course we can sometimes get it wrong, but we are using all of those, using that narrative to allow us to make sense of what it is that you might be feeling. I mean, what we're not doing, and I know we've not mentioned this yet, but it's just a word that keeps on sticking in my mind when I'm listening to you, is what it seems that we're not doing is that kind of almost magical thinking that some of the discourse around empathy suggests that we might be capable of, which is this kind of hot wire into each other's souls, and sort of, I feel your pain, and so therefore I know that you are experiencing pain because I'm feeling some sort of echo of it or something like that. That doesn't seem to be part of what he's talking about at all, and to me that seems really interesting, because it suggests a very different way of engaging with the whole idea that we might be able to understand what someone else is feeling and predict how they might be feeling.
He does spend a long time thinking about the relationship between sensation, expression and language. And in language, he says the word doesn't simply describe pain, it replaces the expression of pain. I'm not sure I know what that means entirely. But is he in danger of... What does he mean there?
I think he's taking us back to, the scenario when you're sitting there with a little child, and they're crying, and you say to them things like, "Does it hurt? So it hurts. Does it hurt?" my acting skills are being stretched to the limit here. When we're in the grip of this kind of interiority picture, we might be inclined to think that those kinds of details about how the language of pain is learned don't really matter. What really matters is this little kind of inner drama that Wittgenstein talks about in some of the nuts and bolts of the argument, where you really, what happens when you learn what pain is you identify within yourself a certain sensation and you attach a certain label to it, inner label, so to speak. But one of the reasons why Wittgenstein is talking about natural expression and so forth is to say, in actual fact, the way in which the language of pain that we have, and you might say it's the only language of pain that we have, although it'll take lots of different forms in different contexts, absolutely, but the way in which we actually teach this language is so different from the way in which the philosopher might envisage when they're in the grip of this kind of story. And it might actually matter to the way in which the concept of pain works, if you like, that it's bound up with these modes of expression. And if there weren't these characteristic kinds of causes of pain and so forth, we'd have a very different concept, and probably a concept we wouldn't even call pain, we wouldn't even associate with our concept of pain. So it seems to be saying we can imagine that our inner lives has this kind of separation from a world around us, but in actual fact the way in which the concepts we use are taught and used depends on the way in which these concepts are actually embedded in this broader life, even if we as philosophers might manage to convince ourselves that that's not the case.
I was thinking about, I have a young daughter, and I was thinking about when I'm teaching her pain words, because that is a thing that you do, so it is true that if you're in the grip of, you've just dropped a hammer on your toe, then you are having pain. But there are lots of other things about pain that are not captured by that dropping a hammer on your toe moment. So, for example, tickling my daughter the other day, she said, it itches. And it's like, well, no, it doesn't itch. It's a tickle. And I was trying to explain to her the difference between itching and tickling. And then another point, don't tickle me, it hurts. It's like, well, it's not supposed to hurt. And then if you're ill, I was also thinking about when you're ill or you're in at a doctor's and they're saying, well, show me where the pain is, and you get your diagram and you colour it in harder red if it's really hurts and lighter red if it doesn't. And I was thinking about the ways in which we try and articulate pain, not through one single beetle in a box, but through a continuum. That's how we deal with pain on a sort of day-to-day basis. So, is it a stabbing pain or a sort of thumping pain, or all these sort of other words that we use to try and articulate the differences between our kinds of pains. We don't tend to refer back to the original pain or the beetle in the box moment. We tend to sort of try and compare and contrast until we found some sort of equilibrium word that allows us to feel like we more or less understand what each other is saying. And one of the things that's so interesting about pain is that there is always that sort of gap, isn't there? There's always that sort of slippage and that little thing where we just we know that we don't really, but we more or less think we understand what each other is talking about. That's why it's such a brilliant example. And I think for me, I'm always really conscious of that gap, of that slippage, of trying but failing to understand what it is that someone is feeling. And I mean, in a way, I think there's an extraordinary arrogance to assuming that you can completely understand what someone feels. And I don't think I really even want to be in that position. I think I'm more interested in trying to understand the ways in which the culture that I live has shaped the kinds of feelings that I think I'm capable of, and then knowing that has happened, assume that a similar process has occurred with someone else, and trying to understand what that process is, and then working backwards to think perhaps I understand some measure of what they might be feeling right now. But the idea that I might somehow immediately get the emotion that they feel, I think would be a very strange, really, way of thinking about things.
I agree absolutely. And I think one of the things that Wittgenstein is most interested in about this fantasy of privacy, if we accept the force of his argument, is that it short-circuits all that complexity. I mean, he does emphasise that it's perfectly possible for us to know what other people are feeling. He doesn't say it's easy. It actually involves a lot of hard, concrete, detailed, interactive work with someone who you have to pay careful attention to. But if we tell ourselves a story which effectively guarantees that we're bound to fail, then we're never going to have to engage in that hard work. And that is a very good reason for telling the story, isn't it? Because it means that you can sort of get yourself off the hook at paying careful attention to what concrete other people in your lives are actually thinking and feeling. You're saying, look, there's no point in engaging in this enterprise because no matter how hard I work, it's going to be essentially inaccessible to me. And that person is essentially inaccessible to me.
And it's not my fault, it's the metaphysics.
It's the metaphysics of it. It's just the human condition. Ignorance, an inability properly to understand what the other person is thinking and feeling. And it works the other way as well. I mean, if you tell that same metaphysical story about yourself, then you're off the hook of having to do the hard, concrete work of trying to convey what you're thinking and feeling to other people.
Let me pick up on this idea that the inaccessibility of others lets us off the hook, or the idea of the inaccessibility of others lets us off the hook, because I think you're suggesting that Wittgenstein doesn't accept that others are inaccessible. So what does that mean, that the inaccessibility of others lets us off the hook?
Well, it's a theme in the work of an American philosopher, Stanley Cavell, who Stephen knows very well, written a book on, that to explore what you might think of as the emotional or even sort of spiritual payoff of allowing yourself to believe in this kind of interiority. Another way of thinking about the notion of a private language is that it's a fantasy of inexpressiveness. It allows you to imagine that your inner life is not constantly, as it were, leaking out to other people. It allows you to think that you control what other people know about you, when, in fact, we don't. allowing yourself to believe in this kind of interiority gives you a certain kind of control over your lives, which, if Wittgenstein and Cavell are right, is a fantasy. We don't have this kind of control over what others know about us. Correspondingly, it's no longer, if you like, a reflection on me that I can't really relate to what's going on in your inner life, because it's the mind-body problem, I'm afraid. It's not that I'm inattentive, or it's not that I don't care. It's just the metaphysics, So I couldn't possibly have known what was going on inside you, because it's like, in no case do we ever know what's going on inside another person.
Are you saying that skeptical philosophy is a way of us abnegating our responsibility to others? If there's a radical break between us and the world, then we don't have to be responsible for others?
Yeah, so there's a nice expression that D.H. Lawrence used, and he was talking about this vision of autonomy and separation that you find within philosophy. And Lawrence talked about the way in which philosophers seem to want to be little mortal absolutes, he says. You have, your domain is small, it's little, but you have absolute jurisdiction over it. It's the contents of your own mind. It's not much, but what you've got, you have absolute control over, absolute perfect knowledge of it as well.
And that's crucial, right? Because that makes the achievement of self-knowledge too easy, right?
Yeah.
It creates this idea that you merely have to be in a particular state, to be thinking a certain thought or to be experiencing a certain emotion, and it's immediately, automatically, as it were, conveyed to your self-awareness that this is the state or condition you're in. Whereas, coming properly to understand the nature of your interior life, coming properly to understand yourself, is an incredibly arduous, long drawn out process. And if you say, look, we're just automatically assured of self-knowledge, you short circuit all of that and get yourself off the hook for that particular
but also, isn't it a process that requires, or at least in my view, requires you to go outside yourself? I mean, it requires you to understand all of the grammar and logic and languages through which your inner experience is shaped. Right. So it absolutely requires you to go outside.
Yeah. That's right, and that's why the beginning of section 243 that we started off with when we did our little set of readings is so important, because what's happening up to that point in the book is that Wittgenstein is focusing on forms of linguistic exchange that are social, that involve lots of other people. And then he begins his entry into the problem of private language by talking about what you might call reflexive forms of language. So normally we give orders to other people and they would either obey them or not. And then he talks about the idea of giving yourself an order and obeying it or not. So he's pointing out that there are certain kind of reflexive forms of social linguistic exchange. And that's what brings him to the point of articulating this fantasy. What he's really doing is imagining whether it would be metaphysically possible to privatize language. Just to kind of bring it entirely within that domain that Dennis was talking about, so that you could have the whole thing inside you. Not just, whereas, as it were, the natural picture that he starts off with is that you start off as a linguistic being in a social world that you share with other people. You engage with others in concrete, specific ways. And then in certain complicated circumstances, you might take those other directed practices and direct them at yourself. But that comes late in the process. That's a secondary phenomenon. Whereas what the whole logic of privatization does is try and reverse the direction of travel. To sort of say, look, you've got the private domain that you own automatically and metaphysically, and then it's a matter of constructing a path back out where there might or might not be other minds with whom you can engage.
I in my very fumbling philosophy bike with stabilizers, take this to mean that if it's logically impossible to have a private life with its own private language, Wittgenstein is arguing that we can't evade our relationship with others. Is that right?
Or our relationship with ourselves.
Or ourselves.
So, I mean, part of what's driving all this, and I think both Dennis and Tiffany have been pointing at it in things they've said earlier, is that at the most fundamental level, human animals are expressive animals. If you look at a human infant, never mind a child, when the infant feels something, you know about it. It's kind of naturally, pre-linguistically expressive.
Although you never know what it is that they feel. I mean, that's always the problem.
And then what happens is that the social world, as it were, starts structuring that natural expressive repertoire. So language gets fed in, and that little story about, the child cries and then we teach him a bit of language, that carries with it a very strong sense that, as it were, the social gets projected into and onto the child, and the child internalizes the kinds of understandings of human inner life that the grown-ups have already, as it were, been inhabiting for most of their adult lives. And that's the direction it goes in. You're, as it were, naturally brought into the community because you have a kind of pre-linguistic facility for externalizing what you think and feel. You have to learn how to lie. You have to learn how to deceive people. You have to learn how to pretend.
But you also have to learn the boundaries of those categories, don't you? I mean, that the idea, I think, of expression, not in the way that you're using it, but one way that it can sound like is if someone, I feel angry and now I'm going to express that anger. But actually, I think that the model that you're pointing at is that, the child or the baby might sort of cry and shout, and that could be all kinds of different feelings and have a very sort of blurry experience for them. But we teach them, now you're angry because you didn't get the thing you wanted, and you're having this sort of facial expression, and you're doing that kind of gesture with your hands and so on. And that's how the child, and as we grow up, we keep doing this to ourselves. We learn these boundaries and we learn these categories, and that allows us then to talk about ourselves as having a particular emotion as opposed to some kind of more inchoate kind of sensation.
Right.
Tiffany, I wonder, to start to round up our extremely brilliant and hard discussion, I wonder if in philosophical investigations Wittgenstein is seeking to provide us with tools to think about our inner life, and are those useful to the history of emotion?
I think the tools are useful to the history of emotions and beyond. I mean, one of the things that I've enjoyed in thinking about this material and the conversation today is thinking about how, this is a philosophical problem, and the problem of other minds is a philosophical problem, but also just how much this impinges on law, on psychiatry, on teaching, how important it is for us to appreciate the difficulties that we have in understanding what other people and recognising and predicting what other people are feeling, and how valuable recognising that difficulty is. Because if you don't recognise that you have the difficulty, then you don't, as we've been saying, you don't make the effort to overcome it and try and understand the differences through which people articulate and experience and perform their feelings. So absolutely, it is very significant in terms of the history of emotions, because it allows us to focus on that public criteria, on those shared languages. That's what historians of emotion study. So without it, we would be a bit lost. But much more broadly, it's important to be brought up face to face with that lack, with that moment of uncertainty, because it forces us into, as you say, just taking responsibility for ourselves in understanding other people. But I think beyond that, there is this big move in the 20th century in all intellectual life to really try and de-center or to depersonalize, as it were, this kind of this idea of the interior and private experience. So, and this can kind of go across all facets. So it's not just emotions, it's sexuality, it's desire, it's friendship. It's all those parts of life that formerly you might have thought of as being personal and private suddenly get opened up for investigation, for trying to understand the much broader cultural and political institutional matrix through which the way we understand our own experiences are shaped. That, I think, is the big legacy of Wittgenstein in the 20th century.
And I think it might be worth mentioning that, as you say, there are lots of different thinkers who are pushing in that same kind of direction, including one. I think the listeners will have been sitting there driven mad by the fact that Stephen talks about two exactly. Yeah. So who's the other guy? So Heidegger is another one of these people who, I assume that's who you're thinking of.
You assumed correctly.
Yeah. So he's another one of these people who's pushing in a similar kind of direction. He's another person who's working on that sense of interiority.
And becomes hugely influential to people like Foucault, who then are obviously very familiar to your listeners.
And Dennis, the thing I'm struck by is that it's not that Wittgenstein is just problem shooting and correcting errors and setting out the logic of our inner lives. He also seems to be doing something more constructive and transformative in his account of that inner life.
So this is another big debate about Wittgenstein, because in some respects it can look as if he is just performing a certain kind of destructive work. And one of the difficult things about when we read the later Wittgenstein is, if you like, the people for whom he's writing are people who are in the grip of these questions that he thinks are confused. So we turn to these texts looking for answers to those questions. He doesn't give them to us, and we wonder what the hell he's doing. Or we're trying to figure out what is he trying to give us an answer or not, and in which case, what is it and why? But he's not, because he thinks that these issues are confused. So if you like, we're in the grip of certain kinds of misunderstandings right from the very off. Now, does that mean that he is just dissolving problems? That's certainly a view that some people will try and argue for, that the exercise is purely negative. He does also seem to be conveying a certain kind of picture of the nature of the mind, of meaning, of language, setting it back into, if you like, the familiar, shared, embodied, historical, cultural world. So while he isn't answering the questions the philosopher might want to have answered, and if you like, providing the theory the philosopher might want, it does also seem as if he is conveying a certain kind of vision of human existence and of what we are and of what thought is and so forth.
And to end, Stephen, does the private language argument and this book, Philosophical Investigations, does it change the way that philosophy is done afterwards?
Well, it did for a while. There was a kind of period of about 20 or 30 years after its publication when the kind of approach to doing philosophy that book represents was dominant in the English-speaking world. But by the time you get to the mid-70s, it had been overtaken by various philosophical exports from America. And I think most of our colleagues in the philosophy profession nowadays would regard Wittgenstein as a figure who's firmly in the history of philosophy. That seems to me to be, not just unjust as an assessment of Wittgenstein, but it shows a real kind of impoverishment in the current state of play in philosophy. I think there's still a great deal to be learned, not just from the particular kinds of themes whose treatment we've been focusing on today, but from the conception of what's involved in actually doing philosophy correctly. A lot of Wittgenstein's self-criticisms, as they come out in the later philosophy, in the investigations particularly, are addressed in the first instance to his early work, to the work embodied in the Tractatus. But the Tractatus in a certain way crystallise certain virtues and certain limitations in a much broader way of doing philosophy. And insofar as those self-criticisms still go home in their target, then there are much broader methodological lessons to be learned for our subject.
It might be worth just mentioning that if you like, the Wittgensteinian package is hard to sell because of the way in which it might seem to be diminishing philosophy. Also the fact that it doesn't seem to be providing answers to the questions that philosophers want, but then that's built into Wittgenstein's understanding of the situation, is that people will arrive with questions to which they will not get answers, because his ultimate point is to show them the questions rest on confusions. They're not if you like, you think you need answers. You don't. You think you've got problems that need solutions. You don't, because the problems aren't what you think they are.
Who doesn't love a philosopher who doesn't give you the answers to the questions you've got? I'm sure people will be scurrying to find vintage copies of Philosophical Investigations and getting their biros and highlighters out. Wittgenstein once said, "Whereof one cannot speak, thereof one must be silent," which is also what we say at the end of a programme. We're out of time. Thank you to my guests, Stephen Mulhall, Tiffany Watt-Smith and Dennis McManus, and to my producer, Luke Mulhall, whose inner life is a golden field of barley filled with gambling unicorns, or at least that's what I think. Join us next time for the last of our week of philosophy, where we're looking at philosophy. Goodbye.